Thanks so much indeed, Kim. A terrible change of pace, and how can you follow that? But I'm going to hopefully give you some quite provocative things to think about. Right at the outset, actually. I want to pick up, indeed, quite a few things from Erica's presentation. There's been, and I want to blow quite a few myths, actually, and quite a few myths about international evidence. And that's been very much a part of the National Curriculum Review, looking at a very, very large body of international evidence and making sense of it in new ways, not just cherry-picking from it or taking naive insights from it, but digging very, very deeply. Now, in what I'm going to say in the next sort of 15 seconds, I'm going to give you a very, very complex anecdote, and it is complex. A lot of assumptions about Asian students in higher education, and so somebody actually bothered to ask some Asian students, they hadn't done for a long time, what was going on when they weren't asking questions in lectures and seminars. Because the assumption was, look, these Asian systems produce incredibly passive learners that aren't prepared to engage in learning culture in the same way in which other cultures are willing to do. Perhaps they're feeling alienated by it, but it's probably more to do with the fact of we have rhetoric about a lack of creativity, a lack of innovation, a lack of personal identity associated with intellectual exploration in these Asian groups. So these students were asked, why don't you ask questions at these universities in places like New Zealand and Australia, where others do? And they say, well, the trouble is, we would never think of asking such stupid questions. Because the questions which people from other cultures ask are the kind of things that we sort out between ourselves in discussion. Okay, now that's really very, very important. It tells us about the importance of learning culture and the fact that we can't make a whole series of surface assumptions. Now, Reynolds and Farrell, when they looked at very traditional classrooms in Asian settings, they followed people like HMI who'd gone in and said, look, we're dealing with much larger groups, arranged much more traditionally, and those are the most important characteristics of an institutional form of education. What Reynolds and Farrell concluded was something very different. These people were, to all intents and purposes, sitting in a very conventional arrangement, in a very conventional setting. But the form of the exchange and the nature of the pedagogy was very, very different. Very oriented towards deep learning. Very oriented towards a very complex iteration between practice and abstract representation, constantly going back between the two. Group work set up so that the teacher could actually check on the progress of individual children. These are all very, very different to the kind of assumptions that were being made through naive observation of these other cultures' learning. Stigler and Siemens have done exactly the same thing. So different learning cultures are very, very important, but also different pedagogic approaches, very different, very important and very different. Paul Andrews, when he looked at Finland, said, in conclusion, comparing Finland, England and Flemish Belgium, he said, I have never seen anything as boring as a maths lesson in Finland. And that, look where they are in Pisa. Now, he tried to get to the bottom of this, and what he established was that a lot of learning goes on in the home in Finland. There's a very, very strong tradition of discourse within the home. So often the lessons were extremely passive. They were just taking notes. They saw that as very efficient because they could get as much as they could out of the lesson. But then they would actually sort out their own learning orientation towards this material and derive their learning from it through a process that occurred outside the classroom. So what I'm trying to do is sort of blow some preconceptions and say that we've looked very sensitively at the international data in reaching some conclusions and in producing some specifications which are currently out for consultation. Now I'll run through some of the pragmatics and relatively boring stuff, but I think quite interesting and challenging. In 2008, when I sat in my office in Cambridge and recognised that there was a problem with the Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 redrafting at the time and discussed it with people like Kevin, I didn't think I'd be standing up here talking about a national curriculum review. I just thought I'd found some interesting problems to do with the way in which the national curriculum was stated. That brought me into the review, but then being engaged in the work made me realise that it was far beyond, the issues went far beyond the question of how we'd got to a position of stating a national curriculum in such a defective form. Until we actually looked at the boundary between control and autonomy, the topic of this conference, I didn't realise that we'd actually be tackling fundamental collective beliefs that are lodged in our educational culture about the boundary of autonomy and control. And some of those beliefs, I think, are very split in a kind of schizophrenic sense, and very, very contradictory. And in essence, the space for learning and who should control it, I believe, is very, very strongly conflicted. And we're seeing that emerge in the kind of public discourse around the national curriculum specifications at the moment. Okay, into the presentation and the slides. Actually, no, let's just a reflection. You mentioned about the importance of being open to the world. That was one of the phrases you used. I mean, obviously, if being open to the world is important, what we need is a national specification drawn up by Whitehall, expressed in detail at 8 levels, which makes very clear what this dimension, this construct of being open to the world is. And perhaps we need a national strategy on that. Okay, nonsense, obviously. But nonetheless, it's an important educational outcome, an important educational objective. That begins to raise some conundrums. Or conundra. Wise choices. Okay, so wise choices made by people in relationship to qualifications in terms of their own personal progression and so on. So obviously, what they need, that's what's talked about constantly, is access to information. That's what comes out of so many reviews. Good choices are predicated on access to information. No discussion of the personal capital you need to exercise those choices. No discussion of personal identity formation in relationship to those choices. Now education and schooling is a context in which those 3 things are relevant, not just the first. But the state sees itself as being associated with the provision of access of information. Very naive. So we have to think about these matters in a very, very sophisticated way. Yes, again, picking up the initial presentation, we have suffered from a narrow and over-prescriptive national curriculum. And we have been preoccupied by measurable outcomes, in many cases for sensible reasons. But I'll come on to that in just a second. I'm interested in the full range of personal and social goods that are derived from schooling. And as you can see, I am very hesitant about the notion that all of these things should be specified by the state in detail. I believe there should be a national curriculum, but there also should be general duties on schools. And many things which we want to derive from state-funded education should be expressed as general duties and not over-prescribed from the centre. So what is the schizophrenia? The schizophrenia is, and I hear this at conferences, and it's said in a rather aggressive way, the state gives things that are too detailed to schools. They prescribe in too much detail, they tell us what to do. I wish they'd stop doing this, and I wish they'd stop giving us these over-detailed prescriptions. And by the way, if something's not demanded of us in central diktat, we won't do it. Okay. Now that's actually been said to me at conferences. Okay. Why have you left that out of the national curriculum? Because if it's not in detail, we won't do it. That's very, very, very odd. It really is very odd. And I was very interested to think of the processes historical processes, think through the historical process by which we got there, and to contrast this thinking with the thinking that we see in other countries, like Finland. National curriculum for 120 years, very lightly stated now, very low levels of central inspection, very high levels of autonomy in schools, very high levels of teacher qualification. But how they got there was not through adopting the same constellation or arrangement of control and autonomy that they have now in the past. They got there through different means, and I'll come on to that. So some subjects perhaps should be specified in greater detail, but reduced in scope. so that they're not so overbearing, but they are clear. So we don't have an over-demanding national curriculum, over-prescriptive. Others, perhaps, should be specified as a framework. And John Bang's notion of a framework national curriculum that's in places like New Zealand. And we have got a system which is dominated by narrow instrumentalism, undoubtedly. And that narrow instrumentalism comes in the form of perceptions from young people that do say in the classroom, why do I need to learn that all the time? And if you can't demonstrate that, they won't. So those I'll pick up now in rushing through my presentation at great speed, but never mind, with no exciting and motivating visual stimulus at all. Right, here we go. Michael, I told you. Okay. Now, Michael, this is exciting, this slide, for the following reason. When Michael Gove asked me to go and give a presentation here, what should we do with the national curriculum here? And which direction should we go in? We know that you think the 2008 national curriculum wasn't right. Tell us about it. So I said this, and he said, what the hell has that got to do with the national curriculum? And when I said, look, Michael, the point is that Schmidt and Prowat's work says that curriculum coherence is a vital component of high-performing education systems, that everything pulls in the same direction, that assessment does not pull in the different directions of the national curriculum. If a national curriculum is devoted to deep learning, then that should not be prejudiced by something like narrow testing in the last year of primary. Okay, now you can immediately see aspects of incoherence on our system. And the empirical work of Schmidt and Prowat shows that those countries that do well on the basis of TIMSS data possess curriculum coherence. They achieve it through different means of curriculum control. And by curriculum control, it's a difficult word, control, because in Schmidt's work, you see control and you think, oh, that must be top-down. No. Some systems attain it by kind of collaborative self-discipline across the system, but they still make sure that there is coherence across these dimensions. And he said, I see what you mean. And I said, yeah, look, the national curriculum is just a tiny bit of one. And so if we get the national curriculum right, it'll achieve all sorts of things. But it won't give the kind of system performance we see in the highest performing nations. For that, you have to have a good national curriculum and curriculum coherence. And so, goodness me, I mean, it's not that civil servants have never been concerned about the relationship between different policies. But I tell you, there was a team on school choice sitting next to a team encouraging walking to school. Think about it. You have to have policy which articulates coherently and clearly across things. And it doesn't mean that curriculum coherence is some kind of common language. It's a very technical requirement of education systems. So let's bear that in mind. So what I said in 2010 was that because our national curriculum was overbearing, we tended to look at the problems which we had with our national curriculum and failed to spot that most other nations, actually, with notable exceptions like Switzerland, have decided to have national curriculum. And we have not learned from their experiences, because most of those emerged after we had a national curriculum and were so trammelled by the problems that that national curriculum created. There are benefits and ills of a national curriculum, and any national curriculum will give you problems. It's a question of the adjuvant policy which you develop to tackle those problems. But I believe the balance is in favour of having a national curriculum. Academies, free schools, independent schools, I'll come on to that in a minute. All the evidence suggested that subjects are important. Seminal work like Edgar Jenkins' work says that there are different modes of inquiry in different subjects. So if you've got a national curriculum, it's sensible to lay it out in the form of subjects. But that doesn't presuppose how you teach it. You could, for example, have cross-curriculum delivery of science in primary schools. But nonetheless, there are different categories of knowledge and inquiry in physics, biology and chemistry respectively. We need clarity in the statutory elements because in state schools people just did not know what was law and what was not law. The schemes of work, for example, people thought were law and aren't. They thought APP was a legislative requirement until the department clarified it. Now that's serious because there are different forms of democratic accountability associated with different instruments. And some of them are eminently unaccountable. And if you think that they are law, that's a real problem constitutionally in democracy. I believed we needed to focus on concepts, principles, fundamental operations and key knowledge in the statement of a national curriculum. Not in schooling, but in the statement of a national curriculum. there are all sorts of personal goods that derive from education which you don't need to describe in detail in a national curriculum. But a national curriculum should focus on those four things, those four categories. Thank goodness Michael Gove was interested in transnational comparisons in a new way, and we learned a lot from it. And as you can see, this notion of coherence and curriculum control was used extensively in the work, and they're not just naive common language categories. Those are the benefits of a national curriculum. There are loads of them. I'm not going to go through them. So there's evidence. Some schools, for example, in urban areas have terrible problems, a massive turnover of children. So having some kind of structured sequence nationally, so you know what a child has done previously, is very sensible. And so on and so on. Many, many, many benefits. Most crucial of all, I think, in terms of the national curriculum, and that's leading to higher expectations of young people. But there are ills, mainly to do with assessment, acute overload, all groups clamouring to ensure that subject content reflects their interest being included. I mean, the list on my computer, I've got about 120 things. Education about knife crime, chess, farm visits, it goes on and on. Of course it should all be in the national curriculum, obviously. No, but the thing is, what should be in it? Now the point is, if you haven't got a set of principles, you have no idea what should be in and what should be ruled out. It has to be principled. And so we spent a lot of time sorting out what those principles actually are. And I think we went wrong in 2008. We had a review, but it didn't quite really articulate a clear set of principles. And I'll illustrate that very, very quickly. And some of you have seen this before, but it's important to go back to this. This was 95. And frankly, we had a difficult, overbearing national curriculum with some difficult aspects of assessment associated, which Ron Deering really did sort out in 95. And the 99 curriculum was not bad. I mean, it was going well. And then something went very, very strangely, something went weird in the 2008 specification. And I'll illustrate it very clearly. 95, look, oxidation, thermal decomposition, very nice concepts. If you understand those, that's pretty good, actually. Oxidation, the fact that when things burn, there's a chemical combination going on. It's not that something is being consumed and disappearing. So, look at I. When chemical reactions take place, mass is conserved. How is it that some things get heavier when they combust? Okay, now this is deep learning. This is not just facts, or as somebody said recently, factoids. I mean, this is deep learning about an interlace of constructs and concepts. So in 2008 specification, it became this. Okay, it became this. That became this. Okay. And look at B. There are patterns in the chemical reactions between substances. That is chemistry. So what do you teach? And when I questioned this, I was told by an officer, you don't understand what we've done, Tim. For access purposes, we have to have a national curriculum which will give credit to every child. And I had a child, you must remember that, I was a teacher once, and I had a child who was never going to learn much chemistry, so this has to give them credit too. And I said, in response to that is a complete misreading of the legislative requirement of the national curriculum. And this officer at the QCA said, no, I think you're misreading it, Tim. I said, no, you're misreading it. And I think the 2007 redrafting was driven by principles which fundamentally misunderstood the requirements for national curriculum and the requirements of the law in relationship to national curriculum. And here's an interesting thing. Ron Deering made the national curriculum more manageable by making it longer. There were more words on the page, but he genuinely reduced it in terms of its scope. He made it more precise and more clear. And that's interesting. So more statements of attainment, but greater clarity, and reduced scope. In terms of autonomy and scope, reduced scope, and therefore the profession genuinely said it was more manageable, even though the specifications became thicker. So we had in 2007 a dramatic contraction of the specifications in the way in which I've illustrated through chemistry key stage 3. By the way, after I'd asked these questions, the 99 curriculum suddenly reappeared on the website. I don't read much into that, but it was interesting. I asked, by the way, what's happening to the schemes of work? And he said, oh, we've slimmed the national curriculum, but we haven't changed the schemes of work. Think about it. Okay. Particularly in a context where the schools thought the schemes of work were the law. There was a significant reduction in conceptual demand in terms of the legal specifications, and there was an upward drift in and removal of demanding content, in terms of all the points Eric was making about it. So I think, and I argue strongly, that there was a decay in understanding of the original purpose of national curriculum. Crucially, a confusion between curriculum and national curriculum. I said right at the outset, and pick up on those points, that there are all sorts of personal and public goods, social goods, that derive from education. And those goods, I don't believe, should be encapsulated in detailed specifications within a national curriculum. This may seem narrow and instrumentalist in its own right, but I believe it's not, and the Royal Society agrees with me. I think national curriculum specifications in areas like physics should be good epistemic maps of the conceptual and knowledge content of a subject area. And then you begin to see that this kind of notion of a motivating national curriculum, which is up-to-date and motivating. Some politicians said that the national curriculum has been safe in our hands because we've kept it up-to-date. We've constantly transformed it to make sure the national curriculum is up-to-date. Very peculiar. How does oxidation date exactly? And science has changed far more frequently than the content or structure of scientific understanding. So there's something odd about that, and I think it's a real category error to even think that a national curriculum should be intrinsically motivating, and all aspects of it should be motivating. Because a lot of the knowledge just is. It is the best knowledge that we have created so far in our culture. And as I say, it doesn't change as frequently as we have changed the national curriculum. And there's a real confusion between context and concept there. To include within the national curriculum a load of motivating contexts means that the concepts are not clear. And that's what's so fascinating about agent pedagogy, because an agent teacher, when a child, it's clear that a child is not learning something, and the teacher is asked a question by a researcher, why is that child not learning something? The teacher will say, not because they're level 3A, they'll say because it hasn't been presented to them in the right way yet. A completely different model of ability. Yet the assessment and the orthodoxies around the national curriculum have given us, again, a very peculiar understanding of the nature of learning and the nature of the content of learning. So I think but those confusions, I think, are deeply embedded within this kind of schizophrenic thinking in our system. So we need to get beyond this notion of the national curriculum needing to be chock full of motivating, contextualised knowledge, because that gets us into a confusion between curriculum and national curriculum. I believe